Welcome listeners to our series of podcasts exploring the intersection of faith, reason, politics, and the modern world. Today, we embark on a journey through Dr. Shabbir Akhtar's The Quran and the Secular Mind, a Philosophy of Islam, a work that boldly invites us to reconsider the interplay of faith and reason within the Islamic tradition. Indeed, this book tackles a crucial question: how can traditional Islamic beliefs, particularly those derived from the Quran, find meaning and relevance in the contemporary world, a world increasingly shaped by secularism? Dr. Akhtar, a trained philosopher, steps into this fray with a unique approach. He encourages his fellow Muslims to engage critically with the Quran, not merely to extract dogma, but to assess its tenets through the lens of reason. The public square seems to reverberate with misunderstandings, with Islam often portrayed as incompatible with secularism, with modernity itself. Dr. Akhtar, however, challenges us to move beyond such simplistic dichotomies. From the outset, he sets a challenging objective: to assess core Islamic doctrine as revealed in the Quran, not just through the lens of traditional Islamic scholarship, but also through the lens of contemporary secular reason. This isn't about diluting faith, but about demonstrating its continued relevance and intellectual integrity in a world where secular humanism is often positioned as its adversary. It's a call to revive the tradition of Islamic philosophy, one that Dr. Akhtar argues has sadly languished since the time of Ibn Rushd, the 12th century Andalusian polymath who sought to harmonize Aristotelian thought with Islamic theology. Dr. Akhtar suggests that this engagement is paramount, even more so than, say, dialogue with Christianity or Judaism, rooted in his observation that the most intellectually formidable critiques of Islam from the Judeo-Christian world stem not from strictly theological differences, but from a secular humanist perspective. Therefore, their objections to Islamic tenets, such as the nature of God, the rights of women, or the treatment of apostates, echo broader secular concerns rather than strictly religious ones. So let's dive into today's podcast. As always, please share, like, and subscribe.
Ever feel like you're just bombarded with like headlines and sound bites and you just want to like really sink your teeth into a topic?
Right.
That's what we do here.
Yeah. Okay, so we're diving into the Quran and the Secular Mind. This is a fascinating book. It was written in 2007, and I got to say, the title alone is super intriguing. I mean, exploring religious texts is always fascinating, but this one seems to be tackling a relationship you don't often see explored. And it's really intended for like a modern Muslim audience. It's an invitation to think about their faith philosophically. And it draws these really interesting comparisons between Islamic thought, Jewish thought, and Christian thought.
Yeah, you're right on the money with that. This isn't really a deep dive into like the theology of the Quran, but more about how it intersects with secularism, which is a perspective you rarely find in the more traditional interpretations.
Right. It's like instead of just looking at the text through one lens, we're getting a whole new set of glasses to see how the Quran might be viewed through this lens of reason.
Exactly. It's like the author saying, look, you're smart. You're already thinking about these big questions. Let's just like really get into it.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me early on was this idea that Islam, maybe in a way that's different from Christianity or Judaism, faces a very unique challenge from secularism.
Absolutely. The book really suggests that Islam has had to confront secularism very directly, kind of without a roadmap.
Okay.
Whereas Christianity and Judaism, they've had centuries to kind of wrestle with this idea of conscientious atheism. People from within the faith who have really kind of pushed the boundaries and wrestled with doubt.
Yeah. That's something I hadn't really considered before, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. And, when we talk about Abrahamic religions, it's really easy to assume that, because of Abraham, they're all coming from the same place.
Yeah.
They share an ancestor, shared values. Like, it's a pretty simple equation.
On the surface, yeah.
Right.
But the Quran and the secular mind really brings out this interesting thing.
Okay.
It actually suggests that the Quran uses Abraham not to claim kinship with Judaism and Christianity, but almost to differentiate itself.
Really? So instead of like building a bridge, it's more like drawing a line in the sand.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about reclaiming this idea of a pure monotheism that Abraham represents.
Okay.
Suggesting that maybe Judaism and Christianity, those traditions, have veered off course.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there are verses that support this, like
Yeah.
2.135, 3.67, 2.140. All of these verses really push this idea that Islam is the truest, the most direct inheritor of Abraham's legacy.
So for our listener, think about that for a second. I mean, does that reframe how you see Islam's place in the world? I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. It's saying that Islam is really the most authentic expression of monotheism.
Yeah, it really raises questions about how Islam views itself, its place in the world, not just in relation to other religions, but to secular society as well.
Absolutely.
So where does the book even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, right off the bat, it challenges a really common perception of the Quran as just, a book of rules or historical accounts. It emphasizes this idea of the Quran being, get this, a miracle itself.
A miracle. Okay, now that's a bold statement right from the get-go.
Right.
Tell me more about that.
So the book delves into this whole concept of the Quran being a miracle of language and reason, which, think about it, this was 7th century Arabia we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Just having a message wasn't enough. You had to really wow your audience with how you delivered it.
Totally. Even today, when you hear an amazing speech or read a book with incredible writing, it just stays with you,
Yeah,
It's different.
absolutely.
So is that what they're getting at here?
Yeah.
That to really grasp the Quran, you almost have to go back in time to that original Arabic context.
Exactly. It stresses that the Quran, while claiming universality, is deeply rooted in its Arabic origins. And that, of course, brings up the whole debate about translation, right? How do you translate the nuances, the beauty, the rhythm of the original Arabic without losing its essence,
It's like, how do you catch lightning in a bottle?
Right. It's a huge challenge, and the book acknowledges that while making the case for why translation is still so important for making the Quran accessible to a wider audience.
It's a real dilemma for sure. So this whole idea of the Quran as a miracle of language, that's just one layer of the argument here, right? What other threads did you find as you were going through it?
Well, one of the most fascinating things the book delves into is how we, as readers, make sense of the Quran, the whole world of interpretation.
Okay, so how does it do that?
It introduces this concept called, and I might butcher this, ulum al-Quran, which basically means the sciences of the Quran.
Sciences of the Quran. That sounds pretty intense. Are they approaching the Quran with like the same methods you'd use for, I don't know, physics or something?
Not exactly, not in a literal sense. It's not about being rigid, but it's a different set of assumptions about how the Quran is studied and understood.
Okay, I'm listening.
Like, unlike biblical scholarship, where you might use textual criticism to look for inconsistencies or whatever, Ulum al-Quran comes at it with this idea that the Quran is a unified text revealed over a pretty short period of time.
So it's more about understanding it within that specific context.
Exactly.
But that then raises the question, doesn't it? If it's considered perfect and complete as is, how can we, living centuries later, really connect with it without forcing our modern interpretations onto it? It seems a bit, I don't know, almost like we're imposing our own views.
It's definitely a tension, and the book acknowledges that. It cautions against trying to force the Quran into like a modern box, using it to justify our own political views or anything like that.
Right, so it's about finding that balance between respecting the historical context while still finding personal relevance.
Exactly. And that discussion about authority and interpretation, it gets even more interesting when the book tackles the idea of secular humanism within the Quran.
Okay, now that is not something you hear every day. How does that even work?
Right. It's pretty unexpected. And it does it in a way that really challenges some assumptions about Islam's stance on non-believers. Like, it looks at whether good deeds done by people outside of the faith actually mean anything.
That's so interesting, because that's not usually the first thing that comes to mind when you think about how Islam views, well, non-believers. So how does the book address this?
So it points out this crucial distinction the Quran makes between, and I hope I'm getting this right, Islam, which is like broadly submitting to God's will, and iman, which is more about true faith and actions.
Okay, I see. So there's a difference there.
Yeah, and that difference is really key to how they unpack secular humanism.
So let me see if I've got this right. So even if you're not a believer in the traditional sense, you can still live a good moral life motivated by things like compassion or justice.
Exactly. And those are values that, go beyond just one religion.
Absolutely. So how does the Quran address that?
Well, the book emphasizes that while the Quran definitely talks about God's judgment, it doesn't completely dismiss the idea that genuine goodness can exist outside of explicit belief.
So it's a more complex view than people might assume. I can already see how this is going to spark some really interesting discussions, not just about the Quran, but about faith and morality in general in a world that's honestly becoming more secular.
Definitely. It really is, isn't it? It makes you think about these huge questions, what do we even mean by good? Does faith really equal morality? And how does the Quran view people who are, outside of its belief system? So much to unpack there.
It really is. So we've been discussing how the Quran encourages this really nuanced view of faith and morality, but I'm curious, how does it approach other religions, especially with this idea of it being the kind of final revelation? How does that all fit together?
That's where it gets even more interesting, right? The book makes it clear that the Quran doesn't see Islam as just another branch on this Abrahamic tree alongside Judaism and Christianity. It's more like Islam is presented as you could say, the purest form of monotheism, a return to that original faith of Abraham.
So it's not about fitting in. It's about setting the record straight. So does that mean it sees Judaism and Christianity as flawed versions of this original faith?
Well, in a way, yes. It points out what it considers deviations from the true path in those religions, particularly highlighting things like what it views as a move toward ethnic exclusivity and theological errors. Basically, the book suggests that these faiths, although originating from a divine source, kind of went off course a bit, and Islam, through the Prophet Muhammad, represents a restoration of that pure connection.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement, wouldn't you say? Although, to be fair, this whole thing of one faith claiming a more accurate or complete version of the divine message, it's not exactly new, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a recurring theme.
It's like every religion is saying, hey, we've got the most authentic, direct line to the divine.
Right. But what's interesting here is that the book doesn't just completely dismiss or invalidate those other faiths. It does acknowledge figures like Jesus as prophets, messengers of God, but with this, caveat that their messages were, at least from the Quran's perspective, incomplete. They were leading up to, but ultimately superseded by the final comprehensive revelation brought by Muhammad.
So it's like a gradual unveiling of the divine message over time, each prophet adding a layer until, boom, you get the full picture with the Quran.
That's one way to see it, yeah. And this idea of a final, complete revelation, it directly ties back into what we were discussing earlier about interpretation. Because if the Quran is seen as the ultimate unchanging word of God, how do you then reconcile that with our very human need to interpret and contextualize sacred texts within our ever-changing understanding of the world?
Right, because if it's the absolute truth, does that mean there's no room for interpretation, for adapting its teachings to new situations, new discoveries?
And that's the tension the book really grapples with. It proposes that while the Quran itself doesn't change, it's eternal, its application and interpretation in different contexts can and actually should evolve.
So we're not changing the words, but we are changing how we understand those words in the world we live in now.
Exactly. It recognizes that there's a danger in projecting our modern readings onto the Quran, trying to make it fit our own agendas or ideas. But it also stresses how crucial it is to engage with the text, finding meaning that's both relevant to us today and, of course, faithful to its core message. It's a delicate balance, that's for sure.
It's imagine you have a map with fixed points, but you have to find your own way through this constantly changing landscape. So the Quran is like the compass, but we're the ones who have to navigate.
I like that analogy.
But with all this talk about interpretation, authority, how the Quran relates to other faiths, we bump up against this huge question, right? Why believe in it in the first place?
The age-old question. Faith versus reason.
Exactly. And the book, I have to give it credit, it doesn't shy away from it. It argues that the Quran itself gives you compelling reasons to believe, reasons that satisfy, both your heart and your mind.
It's true.
So it's not just about blind faith or accepting without question. There's a rational, intellectual component to believing in its message.
Absolutely. The book points to things like the Quran's own internal consistency, its beautiful language, the depth of its moral teachings. All of that is presented as evidence of its divine origin.
So it's almost like the Quran is saying, don't just take my word for it. Look at what I'm presenting here, think about it, and then decide for yourself.
Exactly. It's an invitation to think critically, to weigh the evidence, to consider that there might be this divine reality beyond what we can immediately perceive.
It's a really refreshing perspective, isn't it? It's not demanding blind obedience. It's encouraging exploration, questioning, really personal reflection.
And speaking of tough questions, this whole debate about reason versus revelation seems to always be front and center.
And the Quran doesn't shy away from it at all. In fact, it actually encourages observation of the natural world, reflecting on the world around us. But there's a very specific caveat.
What's that?
And that is that reason is meant to serve faith, not the other way around.
Interesting.
And verse 2.208 is really key to understanding this.
So it's less about following the logic to become faithful. It's more about having faith and using reason to live that faith.
You got it. It's not rejecting reason outright. It's about putting it in its proper place.
Okay.
And it reminds me of this really interesting historical debate between two groups, the Mutazilites and the Asherites.
Oh, yeah, the rationalists versus the traditionalists.
They disagreed on all sorts of things. God's attributes, the creation of the Quran itself. I mean, they went head to head.
It seems like that tension between using your brain and your faith is still a live wire today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So many Muslims are wrestling with this idea.
Yeah.
How do you balance critical thinking with the submission that Islam asks for?
Right.
And it really gets to the heart of how the Quran is written and understood.
Yeah.
And that really gets to a really crucial point, and it's something the book spends a lot of time with, which is the Quran style. Even people who aren't Muslim will often talk about the language, the rhythm,
For sure.
the flow of it.
Absolutely. You can feel it even in translation.
Yeah.
That sort of musicality.
Yeah, it's meant to be experienced,
Totally. But is it poetry? Is that something I've always wondered about that.
It's a great question, and it's a really complicated answer. I mean, the Quran is very rhythmic. It's designed for recitation.
Right.
Verse 44.58 is a great example of that. And the repetition that some people find kind of strange, very intentional. Verse 15.87 highlights that. It's about creating this sensory, even emotional impact through the language itself. But here's the thing. To call the Quran poetry is a non-starter for Muslims.
Okay, so it's not just about the definition of poetry. It's
right.
about how that shapes the way that you interpret the text.
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
Muslims believe that these are the literal words of God. They're not metaphorical. They're not symbolic. It's a very different approach than, say, some Christians might take to reading Genesis.
Right.
Where you might find more poetic imagery, broader interpretations. Quran, there's a real sense of finality. But this appeal to reason, this idea that the Quran is inherently credible, it still has to contend with our increasingly secular world, right? A world that values science, evidence, a world that can be pretty skeptical of religious texts. How does it deal with that apparent tension?
That's where it gets even more fascinating. It argues that there isn't this inherent conflict between Islam and a reasoned, even secular way of looking at the world.
Hold on, really? Because, I don't know about you, but at least here in the West, there's this perception of Islam as being at odds with, modernity, science, even reason itself.
And that's the misconception the book really tries to dismantle. It reminds us that, historically, Islam has been a driving force behind huge advancements in knowledge, especially in things like math, astronomy, medicine.
Oh, absolutely. These fields flourished under Islamic civilizations.
Exactly. So it's basically saying that this narrative of Islam being anti-science, anti-reason, it's just way too simplistic. It's a misunderstanding of its intellectual history.
So it's pushing back against that stereotype, that caricature.
Totally. It assaults that the Quran itself encourages observation, reflection, pursuing knowledge, all as ways to better understand God's creation. It doesn't see a contradiction between having faith and embracing a scientific approach.
So it's not an either-or situation. You can be a devout Muslim and still value, science, critical thinking, all those tools we use to understand the universe. You can embrace both faith and reason.
Absolutely. And that's what's so powerful about this book's argument. It's calling for a more nuanced, more accurate understanding of Islam, one that recognizes its intellectual tradition, its emphasis on reason, and its ability to exist within a modern secular world.
It's like saying the Quran isn't some outdated relic from centuries ago.
Yeah.
It's a living document, right? with timeless wisdom.
But it doesn't shy away from the challenges that message faces in a world that's often dominated by secularism. It acknowledges the difficulties people might have in reconciling certain Quranic teachings, like those dealing with social or legal matters, with more modern liberal values.
That makes sense, because even if you agree that at its core, Islam is compatible with reason and science, there are still those passages that seem, well, difficult to reconcile with, say, ideas about individual rights, gender equality, things like that.
Sure, and the book doesn't try to brush those challenges aside. Instead, it encourages a deeper engagement with those difficult passages. It asks you to think about the historical context, the nuances of the language, the different interpretations that have been offered throughout history.
So it's about confronting those difficult passages head on, trying to understand them within, our own moral framework, our understanding of the world.
Exactly. It's about really wrestling with the text, having a genuine conversation with it, and coming to our own understanding of its meaning in our lives.
Which, honestly, that's what makes any intellectual or spiritual journey worthwhile, right? It's about those big questions, challenging ourselves, and hopefully coming out of it with a deeper understanding of, ourselves and the world around us.
Absolutely. It's that willingness, to really sit with the tough stuff, to have those conversations that are maybe a little uncomfortable. That's where the real growth happens.
It's like we keep saying, this book isn't about giving you all the answers.
And speaking of bold statements, we can't ignore how closely tied the Quran is to Muhammad's life.
Right.
Much more so than, say, the Bible is to Jesus.
For sure.
So how does that impact the way that Islam navigates the modern world? Is that helpful? Is it a hindrance?
That's the million-dollar question, right? This connection between the scripture, the Quran, and the life of the prophet, it creates this real sense of urgency, but also these obstacles to reform.
Okay.
On the one hand, you can make a really strong argument that some practices that might have been tied to 7th century Arabia might need to be re-examined.
On the other hand, reform can be really tricky.
Right.
Because the Quran presents itself as the final revelation.
Okay.
And Muhammad as the final prophet.
Okay.
Verses like 45.6, 33.40 really emphasize that. So how do you square that need for change with this idea that you already have the final word, the complete package?
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox.
It really is. How can a religion be so rooted in a specific time and place and yet also be, as many Muslims would say, the religion for all time?
It's a huge question. It really is. And the book explores kind of two main approaches that Muslims are grappling with. One is this idea of searching for scientific miracles in the Quran. The other approach is a little more about trying to separate what we might call the eternal message of the Quran from its historical context. It wants you to think for yourself, to really engage with the Quran on a deeper level.
Yeah.
Which brings me back to something that really struck me, this whole idea of the Quran as a miracle of language. It really challenges this idea that faith and reason are somehow opposed to each other.
It's so true. It's like, it's not about checking your brain at the door when you embrace faith. If anything, the Quran seems to demand that intellectual engagement, that reflection, that questioning.
Absolutely.
But one thing I find really powerful about the Quran is its focus on human nature.
It's really insightful, yeah.
It is.
It's a nuanced view.
Yeah.
We're created by God. 20.50 is very clear about that.
Yeah.
We're being tested constantly. 23.3.
Right.
But what I love is that it acknowledges our capacity for incredible good and incredible evil.
Right.
Like, it's not shying away from the messiness of being human.
And that's something I think everybody can relate to, that like internal struggle
100%.
between, our best intentions and our maybe not so great impulses.
Right. And the Quran really leans into that duality. We have this capacity for both, and then you have this concept of fitra,
Right.
which is this like innate disposition towards good, towards God.
Yeah.
That's there from birth. But it's not that simple,
Right.
because we also have this tendency to stray, to make mistakes.
So we're hardwired for God, but we're also hardwired to mess it up.
Pretty much, yeah. And here's where it gets really interesting. Verse 2.286 actually says that God doesn't burden us beyond our capacity. Like, he gets it. He understands our limitations.
Yeah.
It's not about being perfectly righteous all the time. It's the striving. It's the intention. It's about being authentically, imperfectly human,
Which is a comforting thought.
It is.
Even God gets that we're going to screw up.
Exactly.
And it's the effort that matters.
It's the effort, yeah.
It's not about being superhuman. It's about being, authentically human.
100%. And it resonates on such a deep level, I think.
It really does. And it makes you wonder, how does this ancient text, with its emphasis on submission, on divinely ordained law, how does that fit into a world, a modern secular age?
Right, where individual choice is really paramount.
Exactly. I mean, that seems to be the heart of it all.
Yeah, you've really put your finger on it, that tension between, this ancient text and the modern world.
Right.
Something so many Muslims are wrestling with. And the Quran and the secular mind really gets into that.
Right.
The book makes this argument that the Quran, just by its very nature, is supposed to guide every part of life.
Okay.
Not just your personal beliefs or your spirituality.
Right.
But everything. And you can see how that creates friction, right?
Totally. Yeah. In a world that's, I don't know, more and more like pushing back against religious authority, it's bound to cause some, headbutting.
Yeah. And it's not hard to see where those clashes might happen. I mean,
right.
Think about verses on modesty, for example, especially for women.
Yeah.
How do you square those traditional readings with the way that people dress today,
Right.
Or think about the Quran's teachings on social justice.
Okay.
How do those ideas fit into these really complicated modern political systems we have?
Yeah, it's not always a clean translation.
Not at all. It's messy. And this is where I think the author's emphasis on really thinking about your faith philosophically becomes so important. It's not about pretending these tensions aren't there.
Right.
It's about, wrestling with them. Muslims have to find ways to bring their beliefs into conversation with this changing world.
Which, sounds good in theory.
Right.
But in practice, I imagine, incredibly difficult, especially if you believe that the Quran is the literal final word of God.
It's a tough one, it is. And the book doesn't try to give you all the answers.
Sure.
It's more about getting people thinking.
Okay.
Encouraging Muslims to really grapple with their faith in this modern context, to do it honestly, critically, and to realize that this isn't just some intellectual exercise. It's about how you live your life.
It's about actually living it out. Yeah.
Exactly. Day to day.
And you know what? It makes you realize that this whole tradition versus modernity thing, it's not just an Islam thing.
Not at all.
It's in every religion, right?
100%. It's everywhere.
Yeah. It's universal.
And the way that Muslims figure out this tension, the path they choose, it's going to shape the future of Islam for a long time.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are big long-term questions.
And it's an ongoing process. It's a conversation. And that's what's so fascinating to me. It's not about these old books or rituals. It's about how people find meaning.
Yeah.
How they connect to something bigger than themselves.
Totally.
How they make sense of this crazy world.
And those are questions everyone asks.
Everyone.
Whether you're religious or not, you're trying to figure out, where do I fit in all this?
100%.
The Quran and the secular mind, I think it gives us this really interesting look at how one faith is trying to bridge that gap, between ancient wisdom and the modern world.
It's a good reminder that it's a journey, And this whole emphasis on reason, on using your mind to approach the divine, it's not just about understanding the Quran, right? The book highlights all these incredible contributions Muslims have made to science, philosophy, math, things we associate with, like pure logic.
It's amazing when you think about it, this rich history of Islamic scholarship. It points to such a deep-seated tradition of intellectual curiosity, of really wanting to understand God's universe through knowledge.
Right. So it's not this either-or thing. It's not like, I can be a devout Muslim or I can be a person of science and reason. They can coexist, maybe even enhance each other.
Exactly. I think that's one of the most important takeaways here. It dismantles this very simplistic and honestly inaccurate idea of Islam being inherently anti-science or anti-reason or incompatible with modernity. It reclaims that narrative and presents this much more nuanced, historically grounded perspective on a faith tradition that has always valued knowledge, that has always valued intellectual exploration.
And that's so important, especially now when, let's be real, there's so much fear and misinformation surrounding Islam. When we reduce an entire faith, an entire civilization down to these stereotypes, we miss the richness, the complexity, the beauty of it all.
You took the words right out of my mouth, and I think that's what this book does so well, by really exploring how the Quran engages with reason, with secularism, with these big questions we all face. It opens up a space for us to understand Islam in a more meaningful, informed way. And that's important not just for Muslims, but for all of us who are trying to move beyond stereotypes and actually have real conversation.
It is like an invitation to a different kind of conversation, one where there's mutual respect, curiosity, and a willingness to actually examine our own assumptions.
And that's what's so powerful about it. We live in a world that feels really divided. But it's through these kinds of conversations, these bridges of understanding, that we can start to create a more peaceful, just, and hopeful future for everyone.
Beautifully said. So look, if you're looking for a book that'll make you think, that'll challenge you, that'll give you a deeper understanding of Islam and its place in our world, the Quran and the Secular Mind is definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely. It might leave you with more questions than answers, but honestly, that's a good thing. It's an invitation to never stop thinking, never stop questioning, and to really embrace the complexities of faith, especially in the world we live in today.
It all comes back to that, doesn't it? That constant search for meaning, for understanding, for connection. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.